We have a terrific panel. This is the second time I've had the privilege of participating in a New York Energy Week, so I'm batting 1,000 right now, and I'm pretty excited about it. And I think these events are just the enthusiasm of the audience, which we're going to depend on a lot when we get to Q&A, is a big part of how these events generate so much of that energy that Scott was talking about. Our panel tonight is really going to follow pretty much a standard format. We're going to have some opening statements. We'll have some discussion questions amongst ourselves. Then we'll get to Q&A from you. I can't really begin to stress how fun it is and how humbling and how much of an honor it is to be on a panel with three people who are so much more knowledgeable about the topic than I am. So going sort of down the line, to my immediate right is Michael Cohen, who's Vice President and lead North American energy analyst within the Commodities Research Group at Barclays. I had the pleasure of meeting Michael earlier this year when we were both on a panel on crude oil exports. I'd say that his knowledge of the data, probably associated with a very difficult and complex decision, came through to everyone in that crowd. I think that'll happen tonight. Of course, you know Angelique Mercurio. She is CEO of EnerKnol, which is the creator of New York Energy Week. I got to meet Angelique when she was one of my clients, also, ironically enough, at Barclays, where she was in the data-driven business of managing energy investments on the environmental markets desk. All the way down on the far right is Dr. Jim Newsom. Some of you may recall his role as CEO of NYMEX up through its merger. Or before that, if you were staying on top of commodities as a business, you may have known of him as the chair, and before that, commissioner of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and one of the chief implementing forces behind the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which has brought us to sort of where we are. And each of these three will give some open remarks, but I first wanted to sort of situate this discussion with where we are. Roll back 6 years. Imagine a man with considerable power standing up on the dais, staring down at a panel of helpless witnesses in chairs, I might add, that were sort of beveled downward from the cumulative weight of witnesses being badgered over the years, so that your arms were up high and your butt was down low and you seemed naturally meek. I'm thinking of the person of Senator Byron Dorgan, senator from North Dakota. Very respected man, very, very prone to fits of pique when he perceived that government's role wasn't being properly served. And he was, I don't think screaming is a fair word for it, because the spittle wasn't obviously flying from where I was sitting. But to my right, about where Jim is sitting now, was the chief economist of the Cftc. And he was something close to screaming about how little the Cftc knew about the commodities business, and how much the price of oil was being obviously manipulated by the role of non-commercial players in the market. It was a heated moment. The rest of us on the panel, for the most part, were being yelled at for having wrong oil prices, which, frankly, was a pleasure compared to what was happening to the poor regulator there. Well, here we are, 6 years later. The CFTC is going about, for the second time, the business of working on position limits. A lot of those non-commercial traders are exiting the business because crude oil is kind of sleepy. And when I say sleepy, sleepy is a kind of a funny term for it. But you did have northern Iraq invaded by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And ironically, this is the kind of thing that if it had happened 6 years ago, Byron Dorgan wouldn't have been screaming about perhaps the lack of visibility into data. He'd have been screaming about how the oil companies were withholding supply or something like that, because the price would have been $200 a barrel or $150 or something extraordinary. But here we are. And it's a world that's interesting in many ways, because it is a world where instead of sort of squinting down at a ledger, where you have coarse data provided periodically to you by government agencies, you have private companies bringing you data not just imputed or estimated, but measured and delivered in real time through a multitude of devices which are excitingly attached to anything from your wrist to your eyeballs. Not here, I don't see any Google Glass in the crowd. But this is the world in which we find ourselves today. And so the questions of discussions that we're going to have tonight really about the role of data in energy investment, energy technology, energy business itself, the market impact, the regulatory picture. That's really where we're going. And 6 years wasn't all that long ago. Senators will be yelling about something else before long, but it probably won't be a question about the visibility into the energy market like it was back in 2008. So maybe to kick us off, Angelique, why don't you maybe give us some thoughts about energy data, just some observations, 2 minutes, and I will be a strict timekeeper.
Sure. So one of the biggest areas that we'll talk about tonight is energy data and regulations. One of the biggest areas for traders, as I experienced from the time I worked on the trading desk at Barclays, and I see a lot of my old colleagues in the crowd, so that's exciting tonight. So a lot of the excess noise is around state regulations. So tonight I'll be talking about how new companies, new generation companies like us, the new kids on the block, are really trying to solve this problem by providing better access to data so traders can review an entire universe of information in unique ways to be able to make decisions.
Well, that's a great place to start, and I think that's going to be an exciting discussion. Jim, maybe some thoughts about the regulatory picture, something to get us started here?
And how big a mess they're in?
Well,
more than happy to. And thank you for your comments, Kevin. Mel, thank you for calling me and inviting me to participate. I very much appreciate that. I feel like I'm a little bit the oddball in the group because I'm not the pure data-driven person at the table, but certainly from a regulatory standpoint, we do have data, lack thereof, lack of the ability to aggregate data that certainly we can talk about a bit later. I think the ultimate question is, how the hell did we get to where we are now from a regulatory standpoint? And I think it's somewhat of a sad equation, particularly if you're on the commodity side. The energy side had very little, if no role in the financial crisis, but nonetheless, we've been captured in the whole Dodd-Frank component of Title VII, and it's having a drastic impact on the way we do business. It's having a drastic impact on our ability to make money in the business. And I think it's very unfortunate that you've got very serious regulatory decisions that have been made in D.C. That have a direct impact on our ability to make business decisions, or we're having to make business decisions based upon a new regulatory scheme. I think certainly we are where we are with regard to implementation of Title VII of Dodd-Frank. I don't think the rules that are finalized will necessarily stay as they are, but it will take some time to make changes, and we have to live with them for at least the short term. I'm very optimistic that we have a new commission in place. If you look at the 5 commissioners, the 2 that were there previously have tended to be the more moderate of the commission, good thinkers, definitely interested in how cash markets operate and what a proper regulatory scheme should be. If you look at the 3 new ones, I think Commissioner Bowen certainly leans more to the left than the other 2. Giancarlo, who comes from a background in this sector, certainly understands a lot of the issues, and he's been public about those in his confirmation hearing and elsewise. The real question mark is the new chairman, Massad, and I've spent some time with him. He's a very, very bright guy. He is a great listener, which we haven't had in that seat in quite some time. He's a cross every T, dot every I guy. So I think moving forward, I'm not sure where he'll end up from a policy standpoint. That's the $1 million question. But I think what he does will be very clear. You'll understand what you have to do and how to comply, and that's all that a lot of people are asking for at this point.
Well, thanks. I think we'll have a little bit more of a discussion about the commission and what it's been up to, what it will be up to, and how it might be different. Maybe, Michael, if you can give us a 2-minute opening thought about market impacts.
Sure. So just first of all, thank you, Kevin, for your very kind introduction, and thank you to EnerKnol and to the organizers of the New York Energy Week for having me here. I come at the issue of energy data from the perspective of both 7 years at the Department of Energy and the Energy Information Administration, which is one of the most important providers of energy data to investors here in the United States, and also 2 years at the International Energy Agency, which if you try to go and find any kind of information and any data outside of the United States, you basically end up at the IEA's website and wonder how in the world to find it is, whatever it is that you want. And so I think it's important to both look at the issue of data both from an energy policy perspective and what ends up as regulation eventually, and also what informs good energy decision making. So I want to try to just take a step back in my very brief 2 minutes and try to give some historical context and why energy data is important looking ahead. So it's important from the national security perspective. Clearly, we went through a period of time in the 1970s that our country was faced with disruptions in oil supply, and the Energy Information Administration was created. Also, the IEA was created in the wake of some of those disruptions, and that was really, in my view, the first step in making a priority of trying to get better data and for the policymakers to make better decisions. So what came of all of this in the 1990s? We had more disruptions. In the early 2000s, more disruptions. And this is not something that you don't already know, but I think it's important to understand that the data is really an evolution. And we have to come to a point, I think, where we can trust the data that we have. And as we get into an age where technology allows us to access many more different sources of data, it becomes a challenge of what is the data that we can actually trust for good energy policy and good energy decision making. So I think in the interest of 2 minutes, I'll stop there. I have a lot more to add on that, and I'm sure that'll come out in our discussion.
Thank you, Michael. That is a good segue. I think we'll probably maybe start talking a little bit about data. And the joke in Washington, of course, is that everything's been said, but not everybody has had a chance yet to say it. And there's a tendency, particularly when you get into that town of mine, for people to want to say everything that has already been said again. So let me say that again. The way this will work, I'm going to ask you guys some questions. I'll direct them. I'll make a suggestion of who I think maybe should be the one to answer it. But if you have additional thoughts that you'd like to add when the answer has been given, we would welcome and invite them, but ever so briefly, rather than a full discourse. So, Angelique, are we providing too much information? I mean, how do market participants and regulators strike the right balance? Do you need a certain amount of data for transparency, and how much is exposing commercial players' positions?
I think it's a big quality over quantity thing. You don't have too much data until someone's losing money on it. And what happens is, with regulatory information, for example, we're at the aggregation phase of this whole big data revolution. We're collecting it, we're finding new ways to access it, tap into it directly, real time. But you can't exactly just give that feed into a trading monitor and expect traders to understand what to do with it, because it's all jargon for the most part, what comes out of regulatory offices. So as far as too much data, I mean, there's constant change in innovation because everyone's trying to get an edge and has all these tools to do so. So we're going to probably see for a long period of time a big need for continuing to have a strategy, a big strategy kind of brain power to really make use of this kind of information before we can really make it into too much, too fast.
So we've still got some room. Any other thoughts about saturation, overwhelming, too much data?
I don't think you can necessarily have too much data. I just think you have to have sources of data that, again, I sound like a broken record, that you can trust, and that comes over time. I think that you've got to be able to cross-check data against, one source of data against another. You have, for example, in the oil market, you have the EIA data that tells you what the market looks like in a given week, but then you have new providers like Genscape or Bentech or other third-party providers that are also telling you what the market looks like in a given week or in a given month, and they're all using different sources. So as an analyst, the challenge becomes to try to reconcile, I'm looking at the Permian Basin right now. Many of you are familiar with that area of oil production. Every single one of those agencies I just named treats the Permian Basin differently because they don't agree on the number of counties within the basin. So trying to get a sense of where production is going and how that impacts markets is a very important task, and it just at this time creates more and more uncertainty if we can't come to some kind of common definition.
Jen?
Yeah, and as you would expect, most of my comments are going to come from the regulatory angle. Too much data in DC makes me very nervous, and I'm talking specifically about trading data versus underlying data. Some of you will remember that Senator Sanders a couple of years ago decided to make some data public, some trading data public, and I ended up writing a letter to the editor of the Washington Post about how wrong I thought that was, and it's a difficult situation because as the staff and commissioners at the CFTC, you're prohibited from sharing that kind of data with the public, as you should be. But if a member of Congress asks for the data, you have to provide that data, and then they don't have the same prohibitions on sharing it, and that's what happened with Sanders. So Congress asking for data makes me quite nervous. I think specifically from the commission standpoint, there was the big rulemaking on the swap data repositories that was going to collect the data and provide it to the commission, and they are doing so. Unfortunately, the commission can't use the data that's being provided because it can't be aggregated across SDRs. And the commission has had one full roundtable on this topic and a portion of the last Technology Advisory Committee roundtable. So if I'm at the CFTC and I have a responsibility to the agency and I'm collecting data that I can't utilize, sooner or later something's going to go wrong and Congress is going to say, what the hell were you doing? You're collecting the data. So I think it's just a very, very difficult situation for the commission to be in right now.
Well, and that was in fact what Dorgan was yelling about was you can't even see the market, he screamed, said loudly. It's dark to you, to your hapless former colleague. This is an interesting, so as we're looking at this from different silos and different perspectives, Michael, you sort of brought up the data integrity, data quality, and to some extent the transparency question. I mean, what sort of gains have been made in transparency, and what's still left to be dealt with?
Well, I think that in the United States, at EIA, I think we've made a lot of gains in terms of improving the timeliness of data, improving the ability, whether it's just production or the statistical methodology around how much product is supplied to the market, and thus how trade impacts that whatever implied demand. On the international scene, we've made major gains in terms of the introduction of JODI, the Joint Oil Data Initiative, which has helped market participants understand where stocks are held in different countries around the world, not just in OECD countries where there was already a reporting mechanism to the IEA, but now we do have JODI that allows us, while it has many faults, to at least try to get a sense of how much stocks are being held in China. Just in the last couple weeks, we've understood that China is increasing the amount of government-held stocks, so that has created a pull on market balances and is one reason for the tightness in markets right now. So without, and I'm not saying even the JODI has been responsible for bringing that to light, but it at least helps identify where the holes are in market balances and helps investors know what is to come in terms of pinch points and pressure points.
Any other transparency thoughts from the panel? Because, you don't have to have an opinion about this, but the Joint Oil Data Initiative is pretty interesting, and we talk about sort of the granularity of data, the way it's grouped and defined. The Permian counties is a funny and poignant example, but there's a lot that's not known. And the CFTC, again, it's what's out there, what's being traded, how do you define a product, how standardized is it, where is it, can it be seen? That was a lot of the debate that got us into the Dodd-Frank situation we're in now. And it almost, not to jump around too much here to Washington, who would want to focus on a place like that? But Jim, maybe can you tell? Finally there's a full slate of commissioners. You brought that up. I mean, what are they going to focus on first? Do you know what their first issue is going to be?
Well, I think, whatever Chairman Massad wants to focus on, so it'll be his decision, and the rest will follow. My guess is he comes to the seat more prepared than most. He's very intelligent. He's had several months with a lot of staff briefings and looking at the issues. So I don't think it will take him as long to get his feet on the ground as many would assume. Now, that said, the fire is hot, and he's had to jump right into the middle of it. He was confirmed a week ago Friday and spent all last week in Europe mending fences with European regulators and trying to find appropriate middle ground between the U.S. and the EU. Certainly, the position limit proposal is a huge proposal for our sector of the industry. People forget that there are really three components to that. Politically, the hard limits themselves have been the most written about topic, but the narrowing of the bona fide hedging definition, new rules around aggregation, I think are just as important, and for most end users are the two most critical components of the proposal. The Commission is having a roundtable Thursday with end users to talk about the components of the position limit rule. So hopefully all the new commissioners will be there. They'll be able to hear that debate and then make a decision on how to move forward with that. But a lot of things, the capital and margin requirements are, even though that's across multiple regulators, not just the Cftc, that is yet to be done. And I really do think that the new chairman is going to clean up some of what the previous commission has done as well.
So you think a lot of what happens here is really reflective of the priorities of the new chair, and
yes.
chair's going to change. So the important point being a new face isn't just a new face; it's a whole new philosophy.
It is, and having sat in both seats, it's much easier to be a commissioner because your role is to simply vote on what the chairman puts in front of you. As the chairman, you determine the topic, you determine the time frame. I mean, you make every determination about how you present it to your commissioners. So he has the much more difficult task.
So Angelique, don't want to ignore you. You seem to be sort of busy this week, but I was hoping maybe specifically you could talk about how your generation of data consumers consume data. How is data solving problems for them? How is this working? I mean, it's not just scribbled in a notebook anymore. It's digitally streamed in real time. How does it work?
Sure. I mean, the basics are saving time and money, and compliance is another big one. Even the bigger players, like the big banks and folks who have all the resources to have every single data provider in the world, still have like 12 to 25 regulatory people full-time staffed in every single major regulatory region, because and I talk to these people all day long, and their job actually isn't to be lobbying or to even really interface with the policymakers, but it's to spend time online looking and pulling together new regulatory information. Because in energy, there's about 2,000 different regulatory offices in the U.S. across state, federal, local, municipal, you name it, and new ones getting active every single day. And with about 150 filings every day, it really does take 25 full-time regulatory folks to keep track of it all. So one of the biggest initiatives that we have, and really our mission is driving forward investment dollars in energy, is to free up a lot of these big brains. Because imagine what would be possible if a regulatory person didn't have to spend 80% of their time looking online, copying, pasting, collecting new regulatory updates and sending it around to the company. If a machine could do that for them, that's 80% of brain power that could be strategizing and making decisions and moving the markets forward.
So, I mean, in a sense, you and Michael are both referring to a parochialism of data. It sort of wants to be warehoused, consolidated, standardized, and digested. And of course, Jim, you're talking about that when you look at sort of the challenges the CFTC has got in terms of what they get and whether they get too much of it, and whether Congress is going to impose obligations on a regulator, for that matter, the submitters of the data that may actually create untoward or unexpected outcomes. So, where are we? I'll make this a jump ball for the panel. Anyone who wants to. Where does this data game? We're seeing sort of like we're in a position things could be changing. Where are we in 5 to 10 years? If we're at our 17th or 7th or 12th New York Energy Week, what do we see?
I'll mention two things that we're working on now that the Commission has done. One is the real-time reporting rule, which was meant to provide transparency to what has traditionally been the over-the-counter market. But a problem is they suggested a one-size-fits-all approach, and that's basically 15 minutes. So I'm going to use an example of a client because they've been on the Hill talking about it. Southwest Airlines doesn't trade regularly when the market appears agreeable to them. They trade out the curve and they trade very large. Other market participants are able to identify who that is. So I don't have to tell you, when another market participant recognizes your position, what happens to you in the market. So it's harming Southwest Airlines. And we raised that as an issue during the proposal process. The Commission was confident that they could keep the market participants confidential. That is not happening. It's happening with others, I know as well. So that's a data problem that's got to be addressed. Another is really a cash market data on Rule 1.53, which the Commission has always wanted to get a bigger footprint in the cash market, even though Congress said you're a futures market regulator. 1.35 requires the reporting of all cash positions that could lead to a futures contract. So to the marketplace, that basically says all cash positions, because at the time of the trade, you're not sure whether that's going to lead to a futures contract. Really, it's an example of the Commission not understanding the cash business of buying and selling grain or oil every day and then netting your position at the end of the day and hedging that netted position. So it's a huge problem, and most market participants can't comply with it.
So what day of the week is it? Tuesday? Gosh, there's going to be an oil market data release from the federal government tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then one on gas on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they probably are counting right up until the last minute. I don't want to put you on the spot here, not that you were involved in any of these government agencies, but is this a market-moving event? Does this make sense that the market should trade around a release of data?
I think that sometimes it's all the market has to hold on to in some weeks. There's no other substantive information. Now, I think it's there are clearly many investors and traders that have been burned for taking a position in advance and then see the market go a different way and feeling, well, why in the world did I advance a trade because of one data release. But I think that as if we talk about how we've improved or how we might improve at the 5-year away from now New York Energy Week, I think that over time these weekly releases become more and more trustworthy. The methodologies become better. The measurement and the survey that goes into a natural gas storage report or an oil storage report, and the census data, for example, that gets used to imply what demand was and stocks are for oil, we will be getting better. I think the other thing to take into account is that right now, the petroleum supply monthly for EIA is a 2-month delayed release. I don't think that we would be surprised if in 3 years' time we see, instead of a 2-month delay to that, we see a 1-month delay, or even a month -1 delay to that kind of release, which will help inform market participants in that weekly data positioning. So I think that unfortunately, coming and spending at least just the last year at a bank and with traders and market participants, I see sometimes a lot of attention, and in my opinion, maybe too much attention to those weekly reports. But at the same time, they don't really have necessarily in that given day much more to trade on. And any day of the week, there's a headline of one way or another that says the market's going this way or that way, and they'll take a position on it because the rest of the market participants are taking a position on it too. So if they aren't taking a position on it, then they're also left in the dust. So I think it's a balance, and I think it'll get better over time. That's just my view.
And no disagreement on my right here? Well, what about, so the government's not the only game in town anymore, right? There are other sources of data, newer, more costly sources of data. People flying drones over storage tanks and taking photos and measuring things with lasers. Got to use lasers and drones in the same question. Are these new, more costly sources causing issues? Are they changing liquidity or participation in markets? Not everybody can afford to pay. I don't want to name names here, but Genscape, for example. Any thoughts from the panel?
Well, I think that clearly what has happened with the advent of Genscape, to name a name, because a lot of people use it, is that if you're not using it and you're not watching the Monday report, then you're also going to wonder why in the world prices went up or down by $2 that day. So I think the question becomes, who can afford that? Is it, as we move into a period of time where commodity shops, are tending to shrink or shift to other entities, are we in a position where not everyone can afford those, or could there ever be problems in Genscape's methodology or any other third-party provider's methodology and how they go about measuring, in which people don't necessarily know whether they're actually getting accurate information until 2 months later? So I think, again, it's about trust, and I think I would open it up to maybe others on the panel to see if there is an issue of liquidity or the number of players that are in the market that can afford this versus those that the other market participants that maybe can't. What are the implications of that? I don't know.
Angelique, as a provider of data and also as a former consumer of all that you could get your hands on, and not always a very transparent world of environmental markets, would you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not a trader, so I can't really comment on the drones or the use of that data. But I think in general we are only at the very beginning and nascent phases of the big data revolution, and players like Genscape and providers that could just provide direct real-time access to information like never before. We're going to see a lot bigger and a lot more of this over the next 5 to 10 years, and we haven't even really begun to see what the analytics players can do. That is something I'm very interested in anticipating. It's only a matter of time before we don't even need a whole lot of brain power to make decisions on this stuff. That's going to be the interesting stuff. But one of the biggest unknowns now is where the trade-off ends for access to open source data and security, especially in an area like energy and commodities, where having open source data could be a major issue of national security. And it's only a matter of time before we start to see a lot more regulations on accessing the data in the first place.
Jim?
I think we're seeing downward pressure on liquidity today. I think it's driven by increased cost in hedging. I think the SEF market that the Commission created has been a disaster. I think you've got 2 SEFs that are still operating in a dealer-to-dealer type scenario. All the rest are trying to operate in an all-to-all capacity. Those operating as all-to-all are falling by the wayside. So you have to ask, what have we done? If we end up at the end of the day and still it's a dealer-to-dealer market, we've all spent lots of money and lots of time to not make any changes to the market structure. I think, a lot of the companies cost. I've got one end user who typically likes to be hedged 40 to 45%, 3 to 4 years out the curve, who is hedged 5%. Now, and that's not what they want to do, but there's less liquidity and higher cost. So.
Well, this is, I think this sets us up for a lively discussion from the crowd. There's a couple of things for Q&A, some basic tenets of Q&A rules. The first is it would be great if you would say who you are and who you're with. The second would be, if at all possible, please try to phrase your question in the form of a question. So I don't know if there's a microphone or how it works, but if you just want to raise your hand, I will point and shoot. Anyone want to?
My name is Marvin Toussaint. I lead social media for New York Energy Week. My question has to do with kind of financial stability, because we're about 5 years after the financial crisis, and our economy is still feeling the after effects of that event. And so do you think that data has a role to play in kind of financial stability, that maybe if people can kind of have an idea of where the market is going, they can know, hey, let me pull back on this, or let me pull back on that? Or do you think that it'll just kind of get folded into the regular way of doing things, and it's just going to be oh, I have another way to kind of go about what I want to do?
Thank you for the question. Stability?
Well, I mean, something that I remember from my days in government is just that there was an increasing concern, and I'm sure that my fellow panelists would also remember this, a concern about volatility. And so all of these data initiatives and improvements in reporting, not necessarily, maybe not improvements, but at least increased requirements around reporting, were meant to reduce the amount of volatility. And something that I would just pose today is, as Kevin mentioned in his opening remarks, about what has happened in the last couple months is we've entered a period of time where volatility is so incredibly low that you also, when I talk to clients, and I'm sure this is not just at my firm but at others, producer clients or consumer clients, why are they going to hedge risk when they're seeing ahead a market that doesn't have a lot of volatility? And so there are implications to that lack of volatility in terms of their willingness to hedge. If someone has hedged 5% in 2015, one of our research analysts estimated that overall for oil and gas producers, they're about 30% hedged this year, in contrast to maybe 10% higher in past years for the year ahead. There's a major implication for what happens if Iraq's 2.5 million barrels a day go offline and prices go all over the place. If they're not hedged, then is there an implication of that? It's an open question, but I think that it kind of comes back to the heart of, is some amount of volatility good? I don't know the answer to that question. Others have more expertise than I would, but.
Angelique?
I mean, I think of finance, I think a lot about time when I think about money. So to me, data is really a tool to save time, and with having better access to it now than ever before, we can make more money and open up more access to whatever games we want to play in life with that.
I think from a regulatory standpoint, it's not a lack of data, it's improper utilization of the data they're currently receiving. And I would argue that in many instances, it may be more dangerous to improperly utilize data than not having it to begin with.
So up front.
My name is Jim Hamsky. I work for Elsevier in upstream oil exploration software. One of my favorite anecdotes along this topic is a welder at a refinery tweeted that he was excited to make some money with overtime pay. And that was subsequently a market-moving event because it foreshadowed the shutdown of the refinery. Has that really changed your lives, whether on the regulatory end or the analysis and trading end? Things like data streams that really did not exist 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes. I mean, the fact that, Twitter, that you can go on Twitter and directly be connected to a news flow of some journalist that, may file a story 2 hours hence. But if I'm on Twitter and I see that, he's saying something about some refinery in the Middle East or some production facility in the Middle East, then I get a jump on that information from other people, and sometimes that happens, other times it doesn't. But again, it's about managing the flow and knowing where you can trust. And we're all bombarded by data and information all throughout the day with a Bloomberg terminal and dailies and weeklies, and there's information overload. So again, it just becomes about trust.
The point, I think, is that also the democratization of information doesn't necessarily increase the quality of the information. It increases the importance of the filtration and the analytics that follow. Mm-hmm. So there are canonical data sources and there are non-canonical data sources. The Twitterverse is a non-canonical data source, but very democratic. And you trade on it at your own peril. You certainly get an edge. What Michael's described is an informational asymmetry, essentially the opportunity to pick up something before the rest of the market picks it up because you know how to read the tea leaves in a tweet. You can see I'm obviously very tweety. But there are other efforts to try to capture information that are happening now that are very different from how they used to be. They include, for that matter, the expert network phenomenon. There's a lot of ways where people try to gain insight into otherwise inscrutable structures. And not all of the information they're getting would be what I would classify exactly as data. Some of it is noise. Mm-hmm. Other questions? And by the way, point of order, I've been advised, please stand up when asking your question, too, in the back there.
I think this question is mostly geared toward Michael. A specific question, if you could enlighten us on MLPs, if you had knowledge on them. We represent a manager based in Texas that has made 4 times partners' money over the last 4 years and contends that he can do that for about another 6 years based on the data coming through that Permian Basin, the Marcellus Shale, that the oil and gas supply will support midstream MLPs in their multi-year contracts, particularly in the distribution and storage area. So my question is, do you support that view? And whether specifically geared to MLPs or the space in general, is there an opportunity there for the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, I think I would defer to my colleagues in equity research that follow MLPs. My personal opinion, following it from a commodities perspective, is that we are in the midst of a revolution in terms of infrastructure needs as a result of the onslaught of a new economical source of hydrocarbon here in the United States. Now, I think the pitfalls, and others, more on this than I do, is that, there's a bit of a chicken and egg issue when you say that, all of the signs point to a need of a pipeline from the Marcellus to the Gulf Coast. Once you have that there, is there a possibility that prices would fall in one part or another to not necessitate the need for that pipeline anymore? And then everyone who paid to have that or paid to have committed, space on that pipeline is kind of out of luck, or those who constructed or the sponsors of that pipeline are out of luck. And that happened already in the Marcellus. And I think there's a risk that, some of these new Permian pipelines or some of these new pipelines out of other emerging basins will be used for 2 or 3 years and then may find, depending on the production, may find them underutilized in the aftermath. And the classic example that I would cite is the issue of condensate splitters, and Kevin can chime in because I know he knows this issue well also. But why are you going to, all of this 700,000 or 400,000 to 700,000 barrels a day, depending on whether you include topping plants in the processing of light crude, are kind of in this basket of and hanging in the balance of what the government decides in terms of whether or not to allow a specific type of hydrocarbon condensate to be exported. And none of those projects, I would argue, are going to move forward. Maybe some of them, but not all of them are going to move forward until there's some amount of certainty on that. And then, let's say you do have certainty, all of those condensate splitters are there bidding up the price of least condensate, and you have a completely different scenario, economically speaking, a very high-priced condensate that is in high demand, which negates the reason you built the condensate in the splitter in the first place. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg. I don't have a good definitive answer on MLPs, but I think that maybe that gives a sense of what we're facing in the next 5 years.
Things are moving fast. A 20-year payback on your infrastructure with things that are changing every 6 months creates some uncertainty. I think that's what Michael's ably illustrated. Up front, did I see a hand? Stan, please, thanks.
Walid Mrabit, Statoil. Question for Michael. When do you think oil will be exported from the U.S.?
It's already been done. We're sending 268,000 barrels a day of crude oil to Canada in April. I think that the government is going to take its time to try to address whether there needs to be any adjustments to the crude export policy. I think there's a lot of different issues at stake and a lot of analysis that still needs to take place before the government makes any decision. So I think in the meantime, even though you could have a decision in 2015, in the meantime, the levers that exist will get used to the most extent possible to take that crude and use it domestically or send it to Canada.
So that's a provocative question. Other questions? I see a motion in the front right. Yes. Stan, please.
Am I allowed to do a second round?
Until the hook comes off and pulls you.
Peter Burgess, True Value Metrics. The United States is arguably the biggest user of energy per capita on the planet, by a mile. I mean, it's about 20 tons of carbon dioxide emissions per capita in this country. It's about 8 tons per capita in Europe, and obviously China's less and India's even less again. How does the market start to put the carbon footprint into the market dynamic? Because at some point that has got to happen. And I would love it to be a private sector, market-driven something, not more regulation, which I would argue, I used to say when I was a student that a government typically can't organize a piss up in a brewery. So, don't expect the government to get it right, but can we get the markets to get it right? And how might that happen?
So Peter's question, externalities that need to be internalized, is it going to be done by fiat? Will it be done by a market? Jim, any thoughts about carbon markets?
Well, I guess at the 30,000 foot level, I would say an effective cap and trade policy. We were hoping that we would have that several years ago. In fact, I started the Green Exchange when I was at NYMEX to try and take advantage of that. Unfortunately, it was my Republican colleagues that shot it down, and it really hasn't been on the agenda since then. But I would think that would be the appropriate market-type solution.
So cap and trade, like leg warmers at the end of the 1980s, probably another 15 years before they're back in fashion. Got it.
But a lot of states have individual systems already, right?
Well, that's certainly true. We're at a point right now where there's a potential federal fiat mechanism that could be solved or answered by states joining into regional trading platforms. So we may be at the early embryonic phase of this market-mediated price on carbon. I saw a question up front. Stan, please.
Thank you very much. Charles Snyder with Thomson Reuters. First, New York Energy Week, dynamite idea. In fact, on the way over here, some friends involved in New York Fashion Week called me and said, "What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually going to the opening reception of New York Energy Week." And they said, "How'd you score an invitation to that?" I said, Don't you wish you knew? Question for the panel now. With the almost, it almost sounds like perhaps an inundation of data sometimes. How would you kind of distinguish what kind of data these days compels someone to put on a trade right then, or for a firm or for a company to put on a trade right then, go long or go short, or what kind of data is just added to your kind of research and process upon which you say hold a long-term position?
So, Michael, do you want to take a stab?
I'll take a stab. I think that it's less the trade on data. It's more trade on analysis of data. So when data is released, the better analysts that you have, the better that you can synthesize what it means and look forward as to whether that position is worthwhile or not.
Angelique, did you have a thought? I saw you nodding enthusiastically.
Yes, I definitely agree with Michael. I mean, like I said earlier, it's not how much data you have. It's data itself can't tell you what to do. There has to always be some analysis and strategy behind it. We haven't yet come to the time where we're like the Matrix and just have machines doing everything for us when it comes to energy data.
Jim, self-aware phones, self-aware computers.
It's above my pay grade.
All right. Other questions? Yes, up front here.
Tiffany Cochran, Barclays. I was just curious for Jim, you mentioned some of the unintended consequences of the regulatory, actions over the last year, 2, 3. And I was just curious what the kind of current environment is in DC and whether there's recognition of the unintended consequences and whether anyone thinks that, some of these things are perhaps not what was intended and, whether there's any willingness to recognize mistakes or, change direction if necessary.
Yeah. Good question. Anytime the Congress passes legislation this large and complex and then relies upon the regulators to implement, you're going to have unintended consequences. So I think everyone understood that going in. I think the level of unintended consequences in this case is probably higher than most people estimated. But the short answer to the question is yes, it's being recognized. I think at both the congressional level as well as at the commission. I think an example of that is the House just passed and will debate on the floor this week their bill to reauthorize the CFTC. Most of that bill is providing fixes to mistakes that the commission has made. And coming out of the House Ag Committee, it had strong support from both Republicans and Democrats, and I think that will be the case as it goes to the House floor. The Senate is not as far along in the process, but Chairwoman Stabenow has definitely said there are some unintended consequences that the Congress needs to address. Chairman Massad fully recognizes that there are unintended consequences, even if all of them haven't been identified. And I asked him at one point, are you concerned that you might get some criticism if you give the appearance of undoing something that your predecessor has done? And he started laughing. He said, look, I've just finished running the least popular federal government history and program in history at TARP. So he said, look, I can take care of it if I need to. And my expectation is that changes will need to take place for years to come. So yes, I think we're on the beginning stages of recognizing unintended consequences.
Okay, maybe 2 more questions. Back there.
Hi, my name is Mike McGowan. I'm an independent trader. Just going back to the cap and trade, I guess this is for Jim and maybe Angelique regarding the basics of carbon markets. But assuming the Republican opposition to cap and trade was largely politically motivated, if Republicans happen to take control of the Senate in the midterm elections, what are the chances that cap and trade comes back on the table and becomes a possibility as a federal policy? And if that happens, how likely is it that it can become, a more liquid traded market in the near future?
Well, I think a couple of things. One, yes, I think the Republicans came out in opposition to it because the Democrats beat them to the punch and supported it. If the Republicans do regain the Senate, then what I would suggest is coming to D.C. and hiring a really good firm that understands the derivatives markets to help you. No, I think we can get it back to the table.
So, back in the historical context department, if we look at where some of the sitting CFTC commissioners are today, I'm not going to name any names of them, but at least one of them I had a conversation with. He was enthusiastic when he was being nominated to the commission because, the CFTC was about to take on regulating the largest commodity market in the world. We were looking at the precipice of what was both presidential candidates in 2008 were for, cap and trade, carbon regulations. It was inevitable. Well, there ain't no inevitable. What Michael said, though, I think an important point not to lose sight of is that there are markets, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the AB 32 market. All you need is a price and a platform and the government telling you to do it. And all three ingredients will be there if the EPA reg goes forward. So you may not get Congress jumping in front of this one just yet. One last question. Yes, up front.
Hi, Kapil Mohindra from Skystream Markets. We did a lot of discussion on the importance of data and information. Just curious for each of the panelists, what is the most influential piece of data or information you've come across recently that's influenced your thinking?
I think I'll give two examples. And the first one is more a larger point, which is that the relevance of data, I think, ebbs and flows given what is happening in the market. So 2 years ago, people could I think that there was probably much less attention being paid to EIA's Petroleum Supply Monthly than there is right now because of everything that's going on in the market. So that would be one. I think it never ceases to amaze me, the snippets of information and the trends that are becoming apparent every single month that goes by in that data release. So I'm very much impressed by doing that, not just because I work there, but it is a good publication. I think the second thing is, let's not forget, Russia shut off natural gas to Ukraine this week. Everyone's being focused on what's going on in Iraq. But I think one of the most remarkable sources of information that I've found, in contrast to 2006 and earlier when I used to follow this at the Department of Energy, is that now Gas Storage Europe has information about what storage levels are in Europe, not only just in Europe, but also in Ukraine. So the market hasn't gotten a lot of jitters around this event because A, we're in the summer, but also because the market understands that storage is ample. And we didn't have that in 2006. We had anecdotal information, but now we actually have a real data source, and I think that's an amazing thing.
It's updated pretty frequently, too.
Yeah.
So there we have it, three very influential panelists who have just taken us through what I think is a very data-filled evening. So thank you for the privilege of being able to moderate the discussion. I think we have some remarks from EnerKnol next.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Emily Bjorklund. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at EnerKnol. On behalf of everyone at EnerKnol, we want to thank you again for joining us. We have a few more people to thank before we have our reception, so if you just bear with me for a second. We want to first thank the Stroke team, so Scott LaBeouf, Kelly Cummings, and Mandy Crooker. We want to thank our board of directors, especially Peter Gardette, who is the chair of this event and introduced the topic to everyone. We want to thank our steering committee, especially Mike Tran and Jim Hamsky, if you guys are in the audience somewhere. We want to thank the New York Energy Week team from EnerKnol, who was instrumental in putting together all the details for this event. So Susie Longval, Tawana Lewis, and May Poon, who are back there. And of course, New York Energy Week would not be possible without the leadership of some of our founding sponsors. So NYSERDA, who is our founding partner, our Terawatt sponsors this year, who are Breitling Energy and Con Edison, our brand partner, the Energy Agency, and finally, maybe the most important partner of the evening is our beer partner, Heartland Brewery. Who is the official beer partner of New York Energy Week. And they are back there waiting with very cold, freshly poured beers for everyone. So thank you all, and please enjoy the evening.